How do you exactly project the standings?
Well, projecting the standings, I think now is more difficult than it used to be because previously you just had to understand a little bit of math. You had to understand how to calculate the schedule strength as each team played a game, whether they won or lost, and things of that nature. Now, I guess to some degree, it's kind of like a social psychology. You know, you have to kind of get in the minds of the voters, and you have to try to guess what it is they're going to do. And I think if you look at the history of the polls, there's a pretty good pattern they follow as to how they react to various situations. But that's really the start of it, is you have to be able to predict what the polls are going to do, because that's 2/3 of the formula right now. And other than that, you just have to look at each individual computer and understand, I guess, the nuances of each one, because they all basically consider the same things, but they weight them differently. And so you have to know that this computer is going to put a little bit more weight on a home win or a road win, or this one is going to look a lot more at your last 5 games and the previous 5 games, things of that nature. And so it all kind of comes together, and you just have to estimate best you can what these different elements of the formula are going to do, and that's how you predict it. I guess it's a little bit easier said than done.
Have there been any changes in recent years that have made it harder to project the standings?
Yeah, and that's what we were just talking about with the move to a more poll-based formula, because before, a lot of it you could just kind of plug into Excel and maybe use a calculator every now and then and figure it out. But right now, 2/3 of the formula is dictated by those voters, and it does make it difficult sometimes. When a number one team loses, especially earlier in the season, you figure they're going to fall back to kind of the back of the pack as far as all the undefeated teams are going to be up there in front of them. But it's not always easy to know exactly where. And then I guess one of the other challenges, and to the credit of the voters, this year I've seen more than ever their ability to kind of reevaluate all the teams after any given Saturday. And in the past, most of the time teams win, they just all move up. If somebody loses, they fall back. But we're seeing a lot more of teams that won, one jumps over the other one, even though maybe in theory they both looked good. And so I think the voters are paying closer attention. That does make it more difficult to project.
What do you think is the biggest misperception about the BCS, something maybe the fans wouldn't realize?
Well, I think one thing that the fans have difficulty understanding about the computers, and we talk a lot about schedule strength and how it impacts the computer rankings. The fans don't understand that schedule strength or the computer ratings in general are only based on the games that have been played so far. And they'll hear somebody say that, oh, this team's schedule is not very tough. And they say, what do you mean they play this team? Well, they haven't played them yet. And so, the computers are, when they plug in a game, they're having to plug in a result, whether you won or lost, what the location was, etc. They can't calculate or they can't account for games that haven't yet been played because they can't assign a win or a loss to them. And so I think that's confusing to a lot of people, that we're not looking at what's left on the schedule. We're not looking at the upside. We're looking at the reality of where things are right now based on what's been played. And I think another thing that fans have a tendency to forget is that computers don't look at margin of victory. And you'll see a team that's going out there and they're wiping up the field with everybody they're playing week after week, and you say, how can the computers not recognize how good this team is? Well, because they're not allowed to look at the score. They're just looking at who you beat, and if the teams that you're beating aren't considered to be great, then you're not going to be as high in the computers as you will be in the polls.
Can a one-loss team surpass an undefeated team, and how? Can you just explain a little more?
Yeah, they absolutely can, and I think the main way that it happens is because the computers count 1/3 of the BCS formula. And most of the time, an undefeated team is going to be ranked ahead of a one-loss team in the polls. But if the gap between them in the polls isn't that big, and a lot of times we just look at the rankings. We just look at this team's 1, 2, 3. But what the BCS does, it actually looks at the points that determine the rankings. And so if the number 2 team is only 4 points ahead of the number 3 team, then they're basically tied, is what that means. And so more than likely, who comes out ahead in the BCS is going to be determined by the computers. And it's very possible within the computers for a team with 1 loss to be ranked ahead of a team that has no losses if the team with 1 loss played a much tougher schedule. We've seen that happen before. It happened toward the end of last season when Florida, after losing the SEC championship game to Alabama, was still ranked ahead of an undefeated Boise State. It's not often that it happens, but it certainly does happen.
Do you see that happening this year?
I think it could happen once again with the SEC and Boise State. if there's a one-loss champion in the SEC, despite all that Boise State has accomplished and despite, I guess, all the credit that is being given by the voters, I think there's a chance that a one-loss SEC champ could be ranked so much higher than an undefeated Boise State in the computers at the end of the year. And I don't think there would be that big of a gap between those teams in the polls that I think it could happen again. And I think it's one of those things that you don't see happen between two major conference teams, at least not to this point in the BCS. We don't see times when there's, at least not late in the season, when there's an undefeated major team that's behind a one-loss major team. But it can certainly happen when the undefeated team is from what we call a non-major conference, one of them that doesn't have as strong of a schedule.
Okay, now what's your prediction for a national championship match this year?
Put me on the spot. You know what, right now, and not that my opinion is any better than anybody else's, but I've got a feeling that Ohio State's going to lose at Iowa. And so I think Oregon is going to run the table. I have a hard time seeing anybody else in the Pac-10 knock them off, even though that's traditionally one of the toughest conferences to go undefeated through. So I see Oregon there, and I think at that point it really comes down to whether Oklahoma or Nebraska can go undefeated. Obviously, if they can go undefeated into that Big 12 championship game against each other, one of them is going to come out and would get that other spot. If they don't, if they both slip up somewhere, then I think a one-loss team from somewhere else is going to get in there over a Boise or a TCU. But right now, the way those teams are playing, I guess I would probably predict Oregon against Nebraska for the national championship. Right now, if you made me pick, I'd take the Huskers to win the Big 12 and have an undefeated season.
What are some BCS stories fans should watch as we head into the final half of the season?
Well, everybody loves the smaller teams. They love the Boise's, which have become big teams, but they started off small because of their conferences. But Boise and TCU, the longer they can stay undefeated, the more fun it's going to be and the more controversial it's going to be. But I would say beyond those two, which are kind of the obvious answer to that question, look out for either Auburn or LSU going undefeated through the SEC, because they started further back in the standings. Obviously, the teams preseason in the SEC, everybody expected would have a chance to be unbeaten, were Alabama and Florida. And I don't think there's any question they would be in the thick of the national championship race right now if they were still undefeated. But with Auburn and LSU having started a little bit further back, teams like Ohio State and Oregon, Nebraska and Oklahoma have all moved ahead of them. But because the SEC has won the last 4 national titles, I think that if a team from that conference goes unbeaten and is unbeaten late into the season, the voters, at least some of them, are going to feel a little bit of pressure and maybe to some degree an obligation to put an undefeated SEC team into the top 2. So I think it could be really intriguing as to how an undefeated SEC team is treated if it gets that far late in the season, whether they jump over some of the other big name schools, especially if it's Auburn, because Auburn was undefeated in 2004 and they got left out of the championship game. And I think a lot of voters still feel bad for them to this day.
And our last question is, Boise and TCU get a lot of attention, but Nevada and Utah are also undefeated and ranked. Do you think these teams get a chance in the BCS game?
I don't think they have a chance for the BCS championship game, and that might sound kind of counterintuitive to some people. Not necessarily Nevada, but Utah. Utah's a team that's right on the fringe of the top 10 already. They've got a chance to beat TCU later in the season, but I think that so much of the BCS is kind of a preseason perception. And Utah, granted, has been in the BCS in recent years. They've won 2 BCS games, but because they didn't do it last year, and because they didn't return all these starters from a team that was in the BCS a year earlier, I don't think that there's that same feeling among the voters that they are one of the best teams in America. TCU kind of gets the benefit of doubt in that respect, and so I think that if TCU loses to Utah, a lot of voters are going to say, well, it was at Utah, or maybe TCU wasn't as good as we thought, and Utah's probably not going to get the credit they deserve for winning that game. I still think if they go undefeated, they could finish as high as 5. I just don't think they'll get close enough to really have a serious chance of making the national championship game.
Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.